Hello everyone, this is Bob Hendry and welcome to CIS278 for the class on October 2nd, 2019. So welcome everybody. Just a couple of things. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to start talking about database objects. In specific, we're going to talk about Oracle database objects and using database triggers. Now this is going to be the first of two parts in using triggers. So I did post for you assignment 6. So you should see the link for that so you can at least get started working on that. But you may not know enough about triggers by the end of today's lecture to actually give that a tackle. But you should at least be able to start looking at that. So for the rest of the day, we're going to be talking about triggers. We're going to have a lecture and some examples on using Oracle triggers. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, electronically, and we can make a meeting either to do this via WebEx or Skype, or we can go over any of the concerns that you might have in person. There we go. It looks like we're all set. So let's learn about triggers. So our objective for this class is to learn about Oracle database triggers. We're going to implement at least 2 database triggers and see how they work. So we're going to talk a little bit about the theory of triggers, we're going to program them, and we're going to see them in action. Now the concept of a database trigger is really easy to understand, and it's important to point out that database triggers work the same or work about the same in any database management system, meaning that even though that we're doing them in Oracle today, they work basically the same in any of the major enterprise database management systems, such as SQL Server or DB2 or MySQL, any of them like that. So even though the code that we're going to write is specific to Oracle, the concept of a database trigger remains the same. Now, what a database trigger is used for is it's used by you, the database developer, to put in the database to actually kind of execute upon some sort of action on a table. Now, what does that mean in English? Now, you guys by now all know how tables work. You build the table, and your table has different columns that are in it. The employee ID, employee name, or what have you, and then you issue SQL statements. Again, you issue a select to get data from a table, maybe an insert statement to get data into a table, a delete to get data out or to delete data from a table, and an update statement. And the update statement is to update data in the table. Now, you know how to do that, or by this point, you should know how to do that. What you can do is you can implement a database trigger for some additional processing or functionality upon one of those SQL statements. In English, every time we insert a record into a specific table, let's do something. What is something? Well, something is whatever you want it to do. Or every time we update a table, let's execute a block of code. Or every time we delete a record in a table, let's execute a block of code. So what a trigger does is a trigger automatically fires upon a delete, an insert, or an update of a table. Now, don't panic if that made a little bit of sense to you or no sense at all, because we're going to do examples of of most of these. So let's go over some data here that we're going to be using for this example. Now, I got some data here that we're going to be using, and what I'll do is I'll make sure that you get these scripts. If not, you could contact me and you could get them. It's going to probably be easier to get you these scripts or to contact me and give them to you rather than just type them in. So don't worry about just watching this for now. You're going to get to the point where you're going to have these scripts to actually write. So we're going to start with some test tables. Why? Because we're just going to need to get some test tables to get this lab to work. So we're going to have a customer table, which you see right here. Now this script should look very, very, very familiar to you. All right, what we're doing is we're building a table, or we're dropping a table called cust, and we're creating a table called cust. Now cust in it Now, cust has 5 different columns. It has customer number, or custno, which is a number. We have name, variable character, address, variable character. The balance is a number, and we have the current date. So on purpose, there's nothing really special about this table. Note that there's no primary keys, foreign keys, check constraints. Why aren't there? Just to keep the table simple. I just want a simple table here in which to play with triggers. It could be a complicated table. In this case, it's not. It's just a simple one. We also have another table called audit cust. And audit cust, just by coincidence, has the same table structure, where we have a customer number, we have a name, an address, a balance, and the current date. Now, again, very, very simple table. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a trigger, pardon me, say that 10 times fast, that is going to populate the audit cust table based on some action of the cust table. Why are we doing it? Because we can. Again, this is just an exercise on showing how triggers work and how we could get triggers to be associated with the table, and we can see the functionality of a table. So basically, again, what we're going to do is when something happens to the customer table, we're going to do some action to the audit cust table. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build a script that's going to build our test tables here. So let me get the copy and paste the 2 tables here, put them to the clipboard, and go into Apex. And I'm going to go into SQL Workshop. And again, feel free to pause the video at any time. So I'm kind of trying to go slow and deliberate, so you'll have opportunities to do that, where you might wait for a long pause like this, right? And you can maybe pause the video and catch up if you like. So anyway, let me go into SQL Workshop. And here, let me build a new script. And I will create a new script. And let me paste this in. Again, I'm building some tables here. Let me make this a little bit larger. There we go. Nothing special. You guys have seen this before. So let me give this a script name. We'll say SC Trigger Lab. Click on Run. Going to run, and we should get 2 tables that are built. Now we're just building out our test environment here. We've done nothing with triggers. So let me just do a run now to build out my lab environment. And we're waiting for Apex to complete. We're waiting more. We're waiting more. Should just take a second. And taking a long time. I'm looking at the progress bar, or on the micro help on the lower left-hand side. It says waiting for apex@oracle.com. So it's running a little bit slow, but we'll give it a second to run. And we should be good. Now again, we get, table created, we're good. It doesn't drop the tables, cust and audit cust, because they don't exist yet, right? Because we're just doing this lab for the first time. But we should see table created. So now we got 2 test tables. We got the cust table, and we have audit cust. And they look like right here. So we got audit cust, and we have cust. Again, just some test tables. So let's put a record into the cust table. What we're going to do is we're going to put a record into it. So we got the cust table, and let's insert a record. So for the cust table, we'll insert a record. How about we do something like this? Insert into cust values, and we'll say values, and we'll put customer number 1, and this is Bob, and Bob lives at 123 Main Street, right, or whatever, and he has a balance of $10,000, And for the current date, watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to put in sys date. Sys date in Oracle just means right now. It's a date, data type that just gets the current date and the time. So we should be good. And again, if you look at this code example, I got some examples up here for different triggers we're going to write. More on this in a little bit. But we're going to put one record into the cust table. So we got this guy right here. So I'm going to pause for a little bit so you can absorb, if you will, the SQL statement. Now we're going to take the SQL statement and we're going to paste it in and put this record in the customer table. So let's give it a second. Got the Jeopardy music in the background. All right, so anyway, so I'm going to copy this to the clipboard and we're going to paste this in. So let me go back to Apex and we'll go to SQL Workshop and we'll navigate up from SQL Scripts and we will go to SQL Commands. Remember, SQL Commands, we can execute just one-off commands like we have here. So you're going to hear some pregnant pauses while I'm doing this. Again, if you hear a pause, that means you can pause the video and you can kind of catch up. So let me run this. I get one row inserted. So I have one row in my customer table. Okay, big deal. I'm not going to do a select from cust because you're just going to see that this data is indeed there. So I'll save you the time. So let's review these steps. We built a cust table, which has a record in it, right? We build another table that we're just going to use to write to when we implement a trigger, which we haven't done yet. And we inserted one row into the customer table, the cust table. I'm going to start calling it the customer table. You guys get it. Alrighty then. Let me go back and start writing a trigger. So let me go to SQL Commands and I'll go to SQL Scripts. And we're going to start writing some SQL scripts to write triggers. So I'm going to go to SQL Script and create a new one. So let's put in our trigger. And again, I'm not going to code this line by line. I'm just going to do chunks of these. And again, by the time you're watching this video, you're going to have this code. So you could do the same. And again, and I'll say this for the last time, I promise you. Well, maybe not. But yeah, feel free to pause at any time because the lab here without any pauses is about 45 minutes to an hour. But don't let that fool you. I fully expect this to take you longer than that because I want you to pause, get this working, pause, get this working. So don't get all excited when you look at the lab and say, wow, it's only 45 minutes. If you're interactive with this, it's going to be at least twice of that. All right, so let me get this code where it says this is trigger 1, and let's talk about this code. So I'm just going to go back and forth and paste this in. I'll give you a minute to do so or to pause. Last time I mentioned that, not. So let's take a look at what this code does. Let me make this a little bit larger. Maybe not that large. There we go. Now this is what we have here. This is trigger 1, and which is trigger 1. So here is an explanation of the code. So this is a trigger. It's a simple trigger. Notice that we've got the drop and create, just like tables. Triggers are objects, just like tables are. So we drop the trigger and then we create it. Now, when we create the trigger, we need to specify exactly 3 things. The first thing we specify is when does this trigger get fired? Now remember, triggers by definition get fired on SQL statements. So that means that whatever in the world is accessing the customer table and is either inserting, updating, or deleting it, this trigger will automatically fire. And that's why they're called triggers. It's probably, in this politically correct day and age, a a very misnamed, name for it, triggers, because they actually fire like the trigger of a gun. It just, upon some action, the trigger gets fired, the code actually gets fired off. Again, probably a bit of a misplaced name at this point, but they're called triggers, so we're just going to have to go with it. So what this says is this trigger is going to fire before a specific SQL statement, in this case, before the update on the customer table. So before an update statement actually gets executed on the customer table, let's fire this SQL. So when does this trigger get fired? Well, not by you, the developer. The system, the Oracle system, or in this case, to be more generic, the database management system is always monitoring if there's triggers on tables and will fire these triggers for you. So with that in mind, we say as database developers that triggers fire silently. They don't actually get fired upon some sort of procedure call, or we don't execute them or ask them to be executed as software developers. They automatically get executed by the database management system, in this case Oracle. So Oracle maintains a list of all the triggers and all the tables and fires them for you. So what this is saying right here is before the update statement is executed on the customer table, do this. And we'll explain what this is in a second. Now you might say this, like, well, when does before update actually happen? I mean, how do we know that update's actually going to occur? When a trigger gets fired, the update statement has already been submitted to the database. So think about it. If you're in, the SQL command line and you're executing update customer set salary equals 1 million where customer equals Bob, as soon as you hit enter to execute that update statement, what happens is the database management system will look to see if there's a trigger on that table. And then it'll look to see if there's a trigger on the update statement. And if there is, it fires it. So what happens is this gets fired upon an update statement. Now, up until your career in databases or in Oracle thus far, we're kind of spoiled. We execute an update statement or an insert or a delete, and we think that it instantaneously just kind of fires. If you're a beginner, you think that, and why not? You issue an update statement, the update actually occurs. But in reality, there's a lot of things that the database management system does before that SQL is actually executed. And one of those things is the database management system, or in this case, Oracle, will look for a trigger on that specific column, or that table. And if it finds it, it's going to execute it. And again, it does this automatically without us being the developer even saying, hey, trigger, go ahead and fire. So again, in that case, or in that realm of things, we say that triggers fire silently. So anyway, this trigger will be fired before the update statement is executed on the cust table. Again, mandatory. And we have here on line 5 for each row. A little bit more of an intermediate topic for an intermediate video on, or an intermediate class on triggers. But let me at least approach that now, since we're looking at it. Put this on the back burner for now. You could deal with this in your further career with triggers, but basically triggers can be fired for each row that's updated in the customer table, or just once, meaning that we want this trigger to fire only upon, singly upon an update of the customer table. Or here what we're saying is for every row that's going to be updated on the customer table, fire this trigger. More on that, again, in your further career with triggers. Then we have an optional when statement. The when statement, again, is optional. And in the when statement, we get to access what are called bind variables. The bind variables talk about what the current value is, which is old. It's a static variable called old, and what the value is supposed to be, being new. For example, if I want to update the customer table and set Bob's balance to 0, what the database management system will do is it'll take a look at the current balance or the old one, and it'll compare it to what the value is supposed to be. We'll go over an example of this. And if they're different, what's going to happen is this block, or the begin block, will be executed. Now I have here a very, very, very simple code example of what happens in the begin block. What can you put in the trigger for when the customer table is updated? The answer is just about anything you want. So I'm going to leave that open for now on what do you put in a trigger, because it's really sort of limited to what you want to do in a trigger. Now, in an intermediate topic with triggers, we'll talk about some design considerations and things that you should put in or should not put in a trigger. And then again, some things that might be definite no-nos. Like, again, if you know a little bit about transaction management, you don't want to put anything like that in a trigger. But for now, we're just learning about triggers. I'm assuming that if you're within the shot of my voice, that you have no experience with triggers or very, very little, and you want to learn more about them and see them in action, and that's what we're doing right here. So in this case, I have a very simple SQL statement. Insert an audit cost values, old customer, which means get what the current customer number is in the customer table, get old, or the current name, in the customer table, get the old address, or what the current address is, in the customer table, get the old balance, which is what the current balance is in the customer table, and sysdate, which is what's happening, it's a date type, which means right now. Today's date, today's time. So this is what this trigger is going to do. And I'll just go quickly now. And again, I'll do this phonetically in English, which is my, natural language. Mother tongue, as I like to say. So when we update the customer table, when an update statement gets fired, for each row that gets updated, let's look at what the new balance is. More on this in a second. Let's compare it to what the current balance is. And if it's different, what we're going to do is we're going to write a record into the audit cost table. Basically, what this is doing is, in English, it's keeping track of anything that's been changed. It's looking at changes for the balance, and it's writing a record to the audit table. Now, audit tables, to get off on a semi-tangent here, is kind of a naming convention that we use to keep track of changes. So we have a table here that we call audit cost, and it's just a plain old table. When we make changes to the customer table, we're always keeping track of what the change was or what the value was, and writing it to the audit cost table. Again, keeping like a trail, or what's called an audit trail of changes. So anyway, let's build this trigger. And again, we're building the trigger now. So we're going to say ST, and we're going to say build TIR build trigger. And we're going to write over this as we go. So we're going to say build trigger, and we're going to change this to trigger 2 and all that other good stuff. So I'm going to give you a second. And it's going to save this as I go. So do the same. And let me go back into my build trigger and do a run. It should build my trigger for me. Again, we'll give it a second. I don't think there's any errors in here. That's why I pre-wrote them for you. And we get row number 1. Trigger does not exist. This is fine because it's saying that the trigger is not there. So what we're going to do is we're going to create it. So this is successful. That's fine. Don't get freaked out if it says with errors here, because this is just telling you that it can't drop a trigger because it doesn't exist yet. That's fine because it's not there. This is the first time we're running it. So now we have a trigger on the cust table. So let's see this trigger in action. So we're going to see this trigger in action by executing a SQL statement against the customer table. So let's go to SQL scripts. And from SQL scripts, let's navigate to SQL commands. Now from SQL commands, again, we could look to see what is in the customer table. So we'll say, let's just take a look. So let's do select star from cust. We should see just the one record that we put in. So I click on run, and there we go. We got one record. We just entered this in. We have Bob. He lives on Main Street. He has a balance of $10,000. Now, let's look at audit cust. We shouldn't have any records in there. So let's do select star from audit cust. No data found. And this is expected. Why is there no data found? Because we have not put anything in there yet. Again, expected behavior. So let's see this trigger in action. Again, let's look at the customer table again. So we have Bob has a balance of $10,000. So let's update Bob's balance to equal $20,000. At that point, the trigger should actually fire. So let's update his balance to $20,000. So we will do that with the following SQL. We will say update cust set balance equal 20,000 where cust no is equal to 1. And I'll pause. Update cust set balance equal 20,000 where cust no is equal to 1. Now, when we execute the SQL statement, by no surprise, our balance should change. So let's run. And one row updated. So if we did a select star from cust, we would see that Bob's balance is indeed 20,000. But what happened was the following. When we issued this update statement by clicking on run, this is what the database management system did. It said, okay, I'm going to issue an update on the customer table. I'm going to set the balance equal to 20,000 where the customer number equals to 1. Before I do that, is there a trigger on the table? And guess what? There is. There's a trigger on the table. And the database management system says, is the trigger supposed to be fired in an update statement? Yes, it is. Are we updating the customer table? Yes, we are. Do I fire this trigger before I do the actual update or after I do the actual update? And the answer is before. Pardon me. So I need a cough button here. So the database management system will fire this trigger. And it'll say, all right, we'll skip for each row. Let's look at this when. Is the new balance not equal to the old balance? The old balance is 10,000. Again, we get that through the bind variable old. Let's get the old balance, or what the current balance is 10,000. The new balance is 20,000. Guess what? It's different. If it's different, continue. All right? Insert a record into this table. Put in the customer number, the name, the address, and the balance. Put in the old, which means the current customer number, the current name, the current address, and the current balance and the current date. Basically, make a copy of this row before it actually changes and put it into a table, which we call audit cust. So now we should be able to see a record in audit cust. And let's see if it's there. It should be. So let's look. Let's see, do a select star from audit cust. and we have one row in here. How did this row get here? We didn't put it in. The trigger did. The trigger was fired when we updated the customer table and wrote a record to audit cost. So this table, audit cost, will keep growing with the changes that we made as part of our trigger. Now, this is just one way to use a trigger. So don't think that you use triggers just to keep track of whatever changes that are made to a table. That's just the application that we're using. We're saying, hey, let's learn about triggers. Triggers got to do something. So rather than just reading about them, let's see one in action. And that's what we're doing here. What you can do in a trigger is really up to you. Like I said, there's going to be some best practices about what can or should be done or not done in triggers. That's beyond the scope of what we're doing. We're learning about triggers. Let's not bite off more than we can chew. Let's not go a bridge too far, right? We're using all these bad metaphors here. So let's just put our money where our mouth is and stick our nose to the grindstone and stop it, Bob. Just stop it and learn some more. All right, so we got that down. So that's a simple trigger. Now, also, let's look at another trigger here. Let's look at the second one. What we can do in trigger 2 is we can specify more than one SQL statement. So I'll give you some dead air here, and this is probably a good time to pause the video and just look at what I have highlighted, because there's going to be a quiz later. Well, not really. There's not going to be a quiz later, but there could be, but there isn't. So we have a modification here. Basically, we're doing the same thing. We're looking to see if the new balance is not equal to the old balance. And again, if it's not, we look at a couple of things. We have the variables inserting. So basically, what we have here is before insert or update. We've seen the trigger work on an update. This is how we can actually compare or look for more than one SQL statement that's being fired. Like in this case, what we're saying is when we actually not only do an update, but when an insert happens, let's do the following trigger as well. So this trigger is basically like the first trigger, except it's being more, what's the word I'm saying? We're expanding its functionality to fire upon an insert statement. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same, except for right here. We're saying if we're inserting a record, execute this code. Why do we execute this code? Because we can. Again, this is just the code that we put in here to fire if an insert statement is getting fired. And also, if we're updating, fire this block of code. Again, what you're putting in here, or what I'm putting in here, is just an example. You could have anything. So here what I'm doing is if I'm inserting, just for example, what I'm doing is I'm putting in like the new customer number. Again, if I'm adding someone, putting in their new name, address, the new balance, and the sys date. Again, because if an insert statement's getting fired, there are no old values because that record doesn't exist in the cust table. So what we do is we use the new ones. And again, we're getting a little bit out of triggers. This is just the application of what we can do. So if we're updating, we do what we did here. We're just keeping track of, keeping track of the record that got changed. So let's get trigger 2 to work. So this kind of replaces trigger 1. If you see here that the names are the same. So even though we're calling it trigger 2 and trigger 1, those are just comments. The name of the trigger is called audit cost trigger. So we're just writing over the first one, basically. And that's fine. The moral of the story here is triggers can be for more than one SQL statement. And we could branch. We could say if it's an insert statement, do this. If it's an update statement, do this. So let's get that SQL to work. To do so, let's go to SQL commands. and go into SQL scripts. And let's just modify the first script for the second one. So let's go to build trigger. Let's edit build trigger. And say, you know what? We don't want trigger 1 anymore. We're just going to change it. Again, I could have typed this in if I wanted, but I'm not going to. Let's run. Make sure the trigger is there. Do I want to run the script? Yeah, I do. I don't know why it prompts me twice. It's kind of a pain in the butt. And we should get trigger, drop, trigger created. That's fine. So now we basically replaced our trigger is what we did. I mean, we got a trigger called audit cust. We're calling it trigger 1 and trigger 2, but in reality, it's called the audit cust trigger. So we kind of replaced the first one with the second one. A small point, but it's worth noting. So anyway, let's go back in and test the trigger. So let's go to SQL command line. And let's test it by inserting a record into cust. We know the update works, so we don't need to test that again. Let's quickly see what we have in here. Let's do a select star from cust. Again, we should have one record in there. We have one Bob, and he's at 123 Main Street. So let's insert a record to see if that trigger is going to fire. Let's take a look at the source for that trigger again. See, we got here with this new balance here. We might want to take this out. See how it looks at the new balance, and if it's not equal to the old balance, this is going to be kind of tricky for us. And I vote we take this out just to show you that we can, because we're not really going to get an old balance there on an insert statement. The old balance isn't going to be there necessarily. So just for grins, if you're following along, let's get this when out. And again, this is a good teaching point because I can show you that when that you see there is really optional. So before we do so, or we do the example with the insert statement, let's rebuild that trigger. And again, to rebuild the trigger, we'll get back to the SQL commands. We could go back up to SQL commands and go to SQL scripts. And then from here, we can edit the script. I pasted my code in. Notice I don't have my when. Let me run the script. It's going to ask me to save it first, and we should be good. Again, and a small point, but an important one, that you may want to get rid of that when just for now. And again, it's a good teaching point because we can demonstrate here, and you can learn that when is indeed optional. All right, let's go back to SQL scripts. Navigate up and go to the command line, and we could test that trigger. So let's go to, again, SQL command. And let's insert a record in the cust to see if that trigger works. So we look at what's in the customer table, and let's do an insert into cust, put in values, and we'll put in customer number 2, and the name is Cassie. We will put in the address of 123 Main Street, and her balance is $1 gajillion. And then we'll put in for the current date, sys date. Now this should work exactly like our SQL statement with for our update. So notice that we don't specify fire the trigger. The system will automatically pick this up and do it for us. So if I do a run and run the SQL, we should get a row inserted in the customer table, which we will verify here. We'll do select star from cust. And we'll notice now that we have Bob for customer number 1 and we have Cassie for number 2. But more importantly, that trigger fired. And again, we don't see that, which is the point. Remember, we say that triggers fire silently, which meaning they give no indication that they ran or didn't run. They're supposed to work like that because it's supposed to be like an automatic code execute upon some SQL statement. Again, some SQL statement being an insert, an update, or a delete. So if I look at the audit table, we should see the results of the trigger. So we'll say select star from cust audit. And click on run. Select star from cust. Let's do the audit again. A-U-D-I-T. Unless I deleted it, let's take a look. Oh, I think it's called audit cust, pardon me. I was going to look at the code example. If you're confused, look at the code example and you'll see it. And there we go. So basically, audit cust is keeping track of, in this case in English, if I asked you in English, explain to me what this trigger is doing, you would say, this trigger is keeping track of all of the changes that we make to the cust table and all of the records that we're inserting into the cust table. And that would be correct. So we're using this trigger basically to create an audit trail for us. Now, there are other uses of triggers as well. We can use triggers to fix data for us. We could use triggers like we're doing here for like an audit trail to keep track of changes that were made for disaster recovery. It would be really nice to do that, where we could have triggers that keep track of all changes. So if we have to recreate data, we have a place to go for that. We can also use triggers to stop execution. For example, if an update statement is being executed and we want to stop it, we can do that as well. So triggers have really just a multitude of uses and really are only limited by what you can think about what you want to happen. Again, go back to a design aspect. And that's what triggers basically are. They're more of a design issue than anything, where you would ask yourself, what do I want to do when a record is being inserted into a table? Do I want to do anything? No. Well, then don't put a trigger on there. Do I want to do anything if something is being deleted? No. Then don't put a trigger in there. Yes. If so, then add a trigger. What do you do in the trigger? Well, what do you want to do if something is deleted from a table? It's really up to you. In this case, what we're doing is we're just writing records out, but we could do other stuff. We could fix data. We could, again, we could stop that SQL statement from being executed. There's really a lot of things that we could do. There's not really a way that you can determine it. So you just can't Google what are things that you can do with a trigger, because that's like saying, I want to paint my room, what color should I paint it? Or I want to buy a car, what should I buy? Well, what color do you like? What do you need to do? And before you pick a car, what are you going to use it for? So it's kind of an unanswerable question about what you actually use database triggers for, especially in the realm of computer science, where what we can do is we can specify exactly what we want them to do and see if it's possible. Remember, just to kind of sum things up here, that in these brief examples, I just wanted to show you just some simple triggers, how we build them, how they're executed, and how we can look to see if they executed properly. And again, large points are how to build a trigger, how to debug a trigger. Notice and observe that triggers execute silently. It doesn't say, hey, I started or I ended or even I was in error. It just kind of just does it automatically, quietly behind the scenes. So anyway, that ends our class and our video on Introduction to Triggers. So I hope you learned something about triggers. Thank you for watching and attending, and I bid you all a very well rest of the day. Thank you.